Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the What If Wrestling Podcast, where we explore the hypothetical scenarios that could have changed the course of professional wrestling. Today we're talking about what would happen if WrestleMania 1 had failed. Always with me, the Wizard himself, nephew Corey. What's up, Wizard?
What is going on? What is going on? This is great. Glad to be here as always. Let's get it rocking.
With my main man, Champ Creed. What's up, Champ?
Listen, in the multiverse of multiverses of professional wrestling, I already predicted 10 years ago where we would be now. So here we are predicting what could have happened, what should have happened, and what can happen in a whole new realm.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Hey, we'll start off here with the Wizard. Wizard, you're the historical guy for us. Mm-hmm. Give us a backdrop here of WrestleMania 1 and what led up to WrestleMania 1 and what made WrestleMania 1 so successful for our listeners.
So you're pretty much in I guess kind of a super vague synopsis of it. You had the feud with Piper and Hogan going on for about a year or so, give or take, and it was picking up a lot of traction on the East Coast and nationwide actually. And you pretty much were getting to a situation where they had I want to say maybe January or February '85. I think the War to Settle the Score on MTV, which was huge. And this is all leading to WrestleMania. And Vince really wanted to get out there in that world of a big show that showcased truly what is kind of the genesis of what we know as sports entertainment. And he wanted to put on this show that really showcased the two worlds, together as one. And March 31st, 1985, you get WrestleMania, and you had, all the stars. You had Mr. T in the main event. You had, Liberace, Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali. It's just all of that and you got to figure 1985. These are the names of names at this point, So to get all of those names under one roof for one big sporting event known as WrestleMania. For pro wrestling at that time, like this is the show of shows. So, like you said, we're here to talk about had this not succeeded, where would be, what would be going on, and I mean that with those cast of names, I think he was pretty confident that it probably was going to succeed.
Definitely, some of the things, as we discussed the factors that contribute to the failure of WrestleMania. Some of the factors that, that was when we're doing research here that we thought about, factors that Piper signed his contract days before WrestleMania. You had the factor that Piper and T didn't really like each other. The factor that that Vince McMahon has put his own investment in there. Hulk Hogan was there. You had a whole bunch of factors that could have went into. People could have felt like, you know what, I don't want to leave my home and go to closed circuit TV to watch this. It's a New York-based event, leading from the territory days and all that. And coming into this big factor. We got a lot to discuss. So, Champ, your thoughts here on some of the factors that you thought could have caused WrestleMania 1 to fail.
Okay. So, and I'm going to rely on Wizard for this one. Didn't Vern Gagne had a show? Didn't our friend Vern Gagne have a show scheduled around this time?
That was, as far as I know, I think it was something that was supposed to be going on in Minnesota. That was kind of a big deal going into this. And mind you, I believe, I could be totally wrong, but I think it was something where he kind of got wind early of WrestleMania and started planning something around this. And, but the problem was for him, a lot of the top AWA talent, literally within the past, I would say, 18 months or so of WrestleMania, had pretty much migrated over to the WWE. I mean, I would say within 18 months to maybe 2 years max. I mean, they lost Hogan, Gene, Andre. I mean, it was so many people that went over from AWA. So I guess to me, this is not any kind of history, but to me, it felt like almost as a get back or as we'll show them, we'll put on something, almost around the same time as them.
Right. But he didn't have the star power.
Nope.
Crockett didn't have the star power or the talent.
Nope.
Because this was the last vestiges of the territory days, and Vince pretty much had a lot of top talent locked in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking what would have to have happened for this show not to go on? And when you sign a contract to do something, they have something called the force of nature clause, right?
Mm-hmm.
There would have to have been something happen cataclysmic.
Yeah, act of God or something.
Yeah, a force of nature or act of God for the show not to go on. Now, what you could have had was something with the talent to become very, very contentious that could have blew it up. And those combustible elements come down to Mr. T and Roddy Piper.
Yep.
They did not get along. This was your main event. So, if you're asking me what would have been the scenario for them failing, or for WrestleMania failing, Piper and Mr. T actually get into a fight before the match.
Yeah, T walks off. Yep.
And Mr. T walks off. That is the only element. And this would have to be a fight that no one sees. It would have to be in the locker room, in the back. It can't be, because if it happens in public, that can be spun to the advantage.
Yeah.
This would have to be an event for WrestleMania to fail. Mr. T and Roddy Piper get into a real backstage dust up, and Piper gets severely hurt. Because if Mr. T gets severely hurt, Piper's going to come out and talk on a microphone about it.
Yeah, and you're right. You're absolutely right.
If Mr. T puts a hurting on Roddy Piper, Mr. T walks out. Now, all you have in the middle of the ring is Hogan, Snuka, and Orndorff.
Yeah, you're literally saying everything I was about to say. Go ahead.
And now you're forced to book a triple threat with Hogan, Snuka, a tag team with Hogan, Snuka, Orndorff, and Orton, which was not billed, which was not promoted, to which the people are upset. The fans are demanding their money back. The press is taking a huge dump over it. Mm-hmm. WrestleMania 1 fails.
Yeah, and see, it's so funny. You said literally everything I was going to say. I feel as though two things. One, I was going to say it could always have been the opposite too. What if Piper walks out of this as well? And that's why I believe, on the underlying of it all, is that's why I think Snuka and Orton were there, because if something happened on either side, there was a immediate fill-in right then and there. And right. That's why I think they were there. If anything went wrong or went awry right before or even during the match, Snuka and Orton were right there to fill in.
Right. But that main event loses its steam.
Oh yeah.
It loses his credibility as a promoter. Now, you do have the card subject to change font, in small letters, which you always do. But the fans ain't gonna be ready to hear that. They don't want to hear that.
And that's and also I fully believe that's why Pat Patterson was the other referee with Ali out there, because I don't think any normal WWE or WWF at that time referee would have been in the position to not that they weren't doing a good job back then, because they were, but to immediately audible in that situation, should that situation have had arose. I think Pat Patterson was probably the only one, because I think if I'm not mistaken, I could be, Pat was already in a position of creative or writing or agent by then anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So he could really rectify the situation before anybody else could. And so I feel like that, because if you really look back at it, there's so many other plug and play pieces involved in that match. Especially with Muhammad Ali being the outside enforcer or whatnot. You have basically 7 wrestlers there instead of, just 2 on 2, and you have a regular referee and you got Muhammad Ali out there. You have pieces in play where you could plug and play all of these people.
Yeah, it looked like Bedlam when you watch the replay, that main event.
Yeah, especially the ending, man.
Yeah. Yeah, the ending just looked like it was insane, and that is the Mania part because it looked like Mania in the ring. So
Yeah.
he walks out. Your main event crumbles. Now what you're gonna have is the press and the media are gonna ask what happened, and then you're gonna have Mr. T, who's one of the most recognizable stars of the '80s, go and say, "I knocked out Roddy Piper. He's a phony wrestler. He can't fight." And Mr. T is going to take a dump on the industry. Dump on WWF at the time. And there is no way that you will get him within miles of a wrestling ring ever again.
And the business doesn't recover at that time either because it's not out there of the nature of what we know professional wrestling as far as the behind the scenes. That's not out at that time.
No.
You have if you have T come out and say that stuff, it's a wrap. How does that company recover from somebody outing the business? Because essentially that's what he could do.
That's what he would be
at
doing.
That point. And also I'll present this scenario to you all. The other way around is if Piper beats up T, even though hey, Piper can go out there, cut promos, all of that about it. It's like you just said, champ. It's one of the arguably biggest recognizable names of the 80s. If they beat him up, it's a black eye on the business regardless.
Yep. Because
they're going to be like, what did you do to this American favorite of Mr. T? These big dumb wrestlers. Why would they, that's what people are going to
say. And let us say this to the listeners that may not be of our generation, right? For the new guys. Mr. T was on a television show. Mr. T had a cartoon.
Yep.
Mr. T had cereal.
Yeah, sure did.
Mr. T had action figures. I cannot think of any entity existing in pop culture right now at this moment that has all four of those things.
Yeah, he's the equivalent of somebody having what he was back then is the equivalent to whoever has like some of the most TikTok and Twitter followers,
Instagram followers. Yeah.
No. Let's say all four: TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat.
Yeah, and everything. The action figures, and those are things of that time period that you're really never getting back.
Wait.
Or he has
wait. Mr. T was the Logan Paul.
Yes.
Of the 80s.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
In a sense. But Logan Paul has a drink, Mr. T had cereal. So yes, Logan Paul is the Mr. T of now, and vice versa.
It's a good comparison. Yeah, based on the things that, because who else is really having that outreach, unless it's like a LeBron or something like that, to where somebody has a shoe deal or something like that.
Kardashian, maybe Kanye.
You know what? That's another good comparison, though. Kim Kardashian, in a sense, is another good comparison. The followers, the makeup, the television show, that actually might be a better one than Logan Paul in a sense. We want to make sure y'all understand this is on the loosest, most foundation-based theory, because we're not saying Mr. T is Kim Kardashian in any sense, other than the comparison of the social impact of what he had in the 80s compared to now. So
he couldn't go anywhere without people knowing Mr. T. The gold chains, the mohawk. He just wanted to be like Mr. T.
He had a look.
He had a
Nobody
look
else looked like him. Nobody else looked like him.
So, which was smart for Vince and them to get him, because there's stories that other promotion wanted to get Mr. T prior to this, and Mr. T had turned them down. And Vince was the one who was able to get Mr. T from the other promotions trying to get some. It made sense for Vince McMahon and Mr. T to work together.
And not to mention, guys, not in a racist way, but Mr. T being black certainly helped. It's a whole demographic you got with that too.
And it was baked in because he was on the A-Team, which came on 8 p.m. 9 Central on NBC.
Yep.
On NBC. NBC, and we know that Vince had just signed a deal with NBC to do the whole Saturday Night Main Event situation that came on a little bit later. So there's potential for this. And the build-up, what we didn't talk about was what made it kind of a success was the build-up, right? The MTV culture, how they were always on, he was always on TV, how Vince was promoting, the promotion that took place all over the place. Because we talked about the match being terrible, how it would have failed on the back end of it. But if you think about it, he had already had people's money up front.
Yep.
He's already had advertisers' money up front. He already had the commercial money up front.
The closed circuit people, like that. I mean that in the sense of you had to pay something for it to be shown in your theater too.
Right.
Like you weren't, you made the money back on whatever ticket sales you did, but you paid out a price to make sure you had WrestleMania shown as well.
Right. And so that money was good up front. The 19,000 people that packed in the Madison Square Garden, that was sold up in front. And now we get to the point where you guys say, look, not only did you have all this money taken care of and all this locked in, you had to put on a good show, because if you didn't put on a good show and it failed, you might not have lost money up front, but you would have lost money on the back end because people would no longer look at your product as it being a top tier product or something that they want you to do next year. It's like we talk about movies, right? The first one has to be real good and a good box office draw in order for you to be able to do a sequel.
Yeah, Home Alone. Home Alone,
Home Alone, Black Panther, right? It has to be a good box office draw for you to be able to do the next one. And so if this wasn't a good box office draw, people thought it sucked, he wouldn't have been able to get away with WrestleMania 2.
And you know what else too that I thought about? Not necessarily, I mean, I'm sure they did it during WrestleMania 1 also, but like you mentioned, the commercials, to have those celebrities on the commercials, because I remember seeing those over the years, WrestleMania 2, 3, 4, 5, like, oh, I'm going to be there, or, tune in to WrestleMania, I'm going to be watching, like, those corny 80s commercials from back then that we see now, that we, think, but back then, let you have, anybody from the 80s, saying, I mean, even the WrestleMania 3. Pat Sajak. You had Bob Uecker, Mary Hart, Johnson, all these people say, I'm going to be there, or I'm going to be at WrestleMania, I'm going to be watching. Like, that was a big deal back then.
They were top stars that were there, but also, what we didn't talk about too, the card was good. Think about it. We talked about the main event, Hogan, Mr. T versus Piper, and Orndorff, and all those type guys. But we forgot Andre the Giant, Big John Studd. That was a big deal.
Hey, listen, before we go any further with the card, I got to say, 18, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Central. I had to correct myself.
Okay.
Now let's go to the card.
So the WrestleMania card was a good build-up. That right there made people want to draw, because you got to have a card. You got to sell it. And then you talk about Liberace and Muhammad Ali and all the stars that were there.
Also, even though it wasn't necessarily you weren't looking for it for its match prowess, but Richter and Moolah, that was also an underlying storyline with the whole rock and wrestling thing too.
That was a huge
deal. That was, to be honest, on what we know as a match card placement and all of that nowadays, that, dare I say, really is the semi-main event of WrestleMania. It
was the co-main event, I believe.
Yeah. It probably was.
Yeah, it was. We had Tito Santana. He defeated the Executioner by submission. We had King Kong Bundy with Jimmy Hart. He defeated SD Jones.
Yep.
Ricky Steamboat defeated Matt Bourne, also known as the First One.
The Clown.
We had Brutus Beefcake with Johnny Valiant versus David Sammartino with Bruno in his corner. It ended in a double DQ. We had Junkyard Dog. He defeated Greg Valentine with Jimmy Hart.
Yep.
We had Iron Sheik.
Yeah, because that was the Intercontinental title match, wasn't it?
That was the Intercontinental title match. The dog could have won the IT title, and they didn't give it to him. I'm hot. Sorry.
We had the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov with Freddie Blassie. They defeated the U.S. Express.
They won the tag titles.
Yep, for the tag titles. Then we had the career versus $15,000 body slam challenge with Andre the Giant versus Big John Studd. Then, like we just said, the co-main event was Randy Richter with Cyndi Lauper against Leilani Kai and Moolah. And then it was Hulk Hogan and Mr. T with Jimmy Snuka, Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper, Bob Orton Jr., Reggie Jackson,
the Knicks,
Paul Oakley, Keith Vanderway, you name whoever was in New York was available at the time.
All of them.
So with that being said, the card was great. Trivia question: SD Special Delivery Jones was the first African American who competed at WrestleMania. Anybody want to know that? Just random trivia. But
and I got more random trivia. 18, 10 p.m., 9 Central. I finally got it right.
Yeah, you got mine.
Oh, gosh, I'm gonna ask you guys this question here. We got the card laid out. We got the card laid out. We got everything here. Now, here's the question for you guys, and we want to elaborate a little bit more on this. If WrestleMania had failed, how would it have impacted the rest of the wrestling world? Not just WWE, but the rest of the wrestling world, like the Vern Gagnes, like the Crockett's. How would it have affected what they done afterwards?
It never makes it out of the territories. Wrestling may not have ever evolved. I know this, that's the premise of the show, it being what if. I just don't, because of the way you look at all the other
territories. Mr. T could have killed wrestling forever?
Could have. Just like he killed his Hall of Fame speech. But, listen, if you see how the presentation was for the NWA, AWA, WCCW, all of those at that time, the presentation of the dark, dingy auditorium and all. WWE is the only, if you look at that stuff back then, and I'm not being biased, but look at it. WWE looked like it was the only show with the lights on when it was at an arena.
Yeah.
And so, if that goes down, I'm sorry, even though every other company eventually perished, for the time they survived, I think they survived because of what the phenomenon of professional wrestling through the presentation of WWF was. Like I said, I'm not trying to be WWF homer but for the presentation of what everybody else and how they were being presented, I mean, for your Ric Flairs, for all of that, all of that was going on in '85 and how it was presented, nothing looked like the WWF. Nobody had a Hulk Hogan. Nobody had, NWA didn't have a Mr. T, and a show on MTV. A TV special on MTV. Nobody had that. WWF surviving and that being a success made it so that people who, quote unquote, there's pro wrestling in town, let's see what it is, even though it may not have been WWF, the fact that they knew what WWF was as far as from a pro wrestling standpoint, they're able to at least go to the shows and say, I went to see some wrestling. Wrestling was the end. What wrestling was in 1998 of how it was just in and everybody would go just to go because it was wrestling. That's how it was then too.
And before we get I want some of our younger listeners who may be listening to us don't understand what territory days were, or some of the wrestling that was some of the companies that were around in 1985. When WWE was there. Some of the ones that were in the United States, you had AWA, American Wrestling Association. You had Florida Championship Wrestling down there. I believe it's during '85. That was Dusty. Around that time, Dusty was down there. Kevin Sullivan. You had World Championship Wrestling, World Class Championship Wrestling, WCCW. You also had the World Wrestling Council back then in 1985, and of course you had the WWE. Yep, Puerto Rico. That was Cologne's promotion back there. And you had the World Wrestling Federation, which was WWF. And then you also had AWA. I don't want to leave Vern Gagne out there since that's a running theme on this show, right? They want to leave Vern Gagne out there, the AWA out there as well. So those are some of the territories that was there in 1985. And so, I kind of want to say these things I think they would have lingered on a little bit longer. And some of them might have gained a little bit of steam if WWE had not done. If WrestleMania would have failed, I think somebody else would have took Vince's idea, maybe a Vern Gagne at that time, and may have tried to do that. Maybe a Crockett would have took it and tried to do that.
With what star?
But you got to look at we talk about Vern later, right? Vern put on a show in September '85, right, trying to emulate WrestleMania. right?
Yeah, but
And
with what Hollywood or outside influence was hitching themselves to whoever Vern had left, or even the NWA. Yes, Flair is a cultural pop icon now, but at that point, he was Ric Flair. He was a character. But if you weren't watching the NWA, you didn't know who he was, and unfortunately that became evident. 7 years later, 6 years later, when he comes to WWF, and the gates are terrible because nobody believed Ric Flair could be in the same atmosphere with Hulk Hogan.
Flair was Flair, but Flair wasn't national.
Yeah,
outside the realm of wrestling.
But that's what Vince did. Vince gave them the national ability because Vince gave them, because remember, when WrestleMania was there, MTV at this time, cable TV is national, right?
But what network is hitching on, what network, such as an MTV or whatever, is hitching on to Crockett? Or, they don't have, there's no Hulk Hogan. That's exactly what I'm saying. There's no Hulk Hogan in any of these territories. Hulk Hogan, Hulk Hogan at that point, he's a phenomenon at that point. Nobody has the charisma, the star power, the look. Hulk Hogan was a 6'8", 300-pound ball of charisma at that point. Flair was a 6'1", 240 technician that you didn't know who he was outside of the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia.
And more importantly, no one is going to attach themselves to the stink of the failure of professional wrestling on that level after Mr. T kills it.
Yeah.
So the territories linger on. I'll let you finish your thought, G, because I have my scenario.
I mean, I think the territories linger on in the failure. I think there will be someone else who not necessarily be successful, but I think somebody else will try it. That's out of ego. Vince didn't succeed. He did make some money. He got some investors. Let me try out of ego to see if I can stick a nail in the coffin of this young guy, Vince McMahon. Remember, they didn't like Vince anyway because he was breaking up the territories. He was putting people together. He pulled some of their biggest stars. So what better way to beat Vince McMahon than at his own game if his WrestleMania didn't be successful?
But what Dick Epperson or whoever is going to attach themselves, like Champ just said, what nationally recognized television network is going to back an NWA? You didn't even. My thing is NWA, AWA, all those places didn't even look like WWF. None of them are putting even their NWA probably was barely putting 10,000 in an arena, and they were running out of Greensboro in Atlanta, and in which these places aren't metropolises like DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, all these other places that WWF is running out of at this point. They're running out of practically nobody's coming to NBC is not coming to Tallahassee, Florida for Florida Championship Wrestling.
Right.
I'm not trying to sound like a jerk about it, but it's like, think about it. Nobody's coming down there to the Memorial Coliseum in Jacksonville to come launch this NWA WrestleMania. They're not.
Right. And also to take into consideration is this. At this time, besides WWE, a lot of these other guys like your Ric Flairs, your Chief J, your Wahoo McDaniels, and those your Sergeant Slaughters and Nikita Koloff, they were rotating still throughout all these different promotions during the 1985 time, and so I think just with the failure of that, some of these guys would have tried to gravitate to somewhere else. Especially if they hadn't got paid with Vince. But like I said, I just think territories would have hung around a little bit longer. Somebody else would have tried it. But at this time, it would have been a great decline for pro wrestling. Champ, go ahead.
Pro wrestling is in its decline. The territories are down. Gates are down. We're lingering to the late 80s, going into the 90s. It's a sideshow. It's the laughing stock. If you tell people that you're a pro wrestling fan, they'll look at you and give you a wedgie. There's no women to date if you're a pro wrestling fan. The talent has aged out. Hogan's in Hollywood. Whoever else had whatever left of a career, Piper's in Hollywood now, because he's still doing movies. You still have Flair, doing what he can for the territories. Let's say in our world, Magnum TA doesn't get injured. He's a star, but he's not what Hulk Hogan is. However, as the early 90s turn, there's the son of a prominent injury attorney who was born in the Bronx, who made his bones in the South, who knows this industry like the back of his hand. And then around this time, he decides to start his own promotion into the 90s. And it starts off small as a spin-off / offshoot of a branch of the NWA and Eastern Championship Wrestling. And then he spins it off and he decides to call this Extreme Championship Wrestling. And around this time, the advent of technology, which could have benefited Vince in the 80s, but Mr. T killed it. The advent of technology with the internet is what helps propel a young Paul Heyman to assert the position at the forefront of the industry with elements of Extreme Championship Wrestling that's pulling in from pop culture. You're pulling in from the porn industry. You're pulling in from Jerry Springer. You're pulling in from the internet. Think about everything that we knew about pro wrestling in the 90s. Paul Heyman uses the internet, the technology, and the pop culture and hip hop and all those things. And every star that we saw in ECW, they become mainstream names in professional wrestling. And Paul Heyman creates the pop culture phenomenon known as Extreme Mania, whatever you want to call it. And he has everything that he needs to replicate what Vince could have created in the 80s that he now does in the 90s. And then wrestling begins its ascent in the 90s instead of the 80s.
So it would it make it that far? What I'm saying is this,
Yes.
because if you look at AEW good gracious, AWA started losing fans because WrestleMania was successful, right? As WrestleMania became successful, fans started watching because, as Corey, you mentioned, the lights, the glare, Vince brightened things up. You saw the brightness. So if you don't have, if WrestleMania actually fails, do we even get to a Paul Heyman? My other point,
and that's what I was going to do. Go ahead, Glenn, because I got something to say on that. On top of that, go ahead.
Do we even get to Paul Heyman? My other question is this, because we know Vince McMahon, if he rebooted the XFL, do we not think that he would have tried again with WrestleMania?
I do believe Vince would try a reboot, but it wouldn't be an immediate reboot.
Yeah, so with the Paul Heyman thing, here's the thing that I think. I see what you were saying, Champ, but it's the cutting of the teeth, the getting his chops in wrestling as a manager for so long, and as a photographer and all of that, and and a writer, all of that experience.
Since he was
Paul
14.
But he doesn't get any of that.
Yes, he does.
I mean, he does, but how long does it sustain, considering that if things are on the downturn?
Look, but all of those territories that you mentioned, he's been through them, and they're still functioning. Now, they're not functioning at a high level, but they're still around. Crockett,
yeah. So
in Glenn's scenario, Crockett is still around. The one from the South, from Florida.
Yeah, yes, but does Heyman make it to 92 or 93 to be able to even leave WCW, to even be able to start up in ECW with the experience that and contacts that he has? Does he ever even get any of those?
Didn't he shoot it in his basement? What experience do you need?
Yeah, but the contacts, the experience in the business, is he getting all of that through his listening? Even though he probably hated it, him being in NWA / WCW between 87, 88 or whatnot, all the way up to like 91, 92 when he left, that's invaluable experience that helps him with the do's and don'ts of what he does in being involved with ECW.
Bro, ECW was a public access TV show, right? It didn't need all the glitz and the glamour.
Yeah, it didn't. But does he even have the experience does he get that experience in the business to do it?
He would have to lose. He would have to, it's trial by fire with this, right?
Right.
And there's nothing to lose because the industry is down. And then whatever talent that you do have, it's not like they got a lot of options.
Right. Does he ever even, but that's the thing. Does he ever make it to what he was before ECW to even start in ECW?
Look, you didn't need to be a biophysicist of kayfabe to be able to build ECW.
We say that now, but if he's not Paulie Dangerously before ECW, does ECW ever even get up off the ground?
He is a cult of personality. You put him in you put Paul Heyman in the mailroom, he's going to be the number one mail clerk in there. You put him at a 7-Eleven, he's going to sell the most hot dogs. Like, you can put that man with his gift of gab in any scenario, and he's going to come out and survive. Look at how look at how many people he's outlasted.
Exactly, but the underlying premise of this is that yes, he's going to be the best of wherever you put him in at. But does that voice even have a sound if he's never Paulie Dangerously?
Right. If he never gets there, or do somebody else come up? Do somebody else come up again? Grab the ball from Vince. And what we're talking about now are the alternative paths of wrestling, right?
Old. Like, that's the thing. Everybody that existed was too old. They didn't have the vision, and they didn't have the technology at their hand. Which Vince had the advent of the advancement of media, which was pay-per-view. So let's say he messed that up. The next advancement of media doesn't come until the 90s, which is the internet. And what we know, chat boards, message boards, all that stuff. And the only person that's young enough to capture and understand it at the time is him. And he's in a top market in the Northeast, like you said. So your media traction, you're going to get that from New York by proxy of being in Philly, right? Most of his talent came from the East Coast. And it's not like you're going to use the old guys and prop your company around him. No, he built ECW with new guys.
Right, but no, not all the way.
Not all the way.
Not all the way. And that's what I know this because this is what if. And I know this is what if, and it's dream scenarios. But we also have some factual stuff that's there. Does he get the contacts and the exposure of being Paulie Dangerously if he's not in the if he's not in the NWA? Does he have that link with Terry Funk? Does he have that link with Shane Douglas? Shane was there in '91 also. So does he have these links to these people that helped build ECW to what it was with the Jimmy Snookers?
So let's say he does, because if you say he doesn't, let's say he does. All right, let's say he does. And now let's go with that. So he has all of those links, and he's starting in the basement with a camera, and who the hell else knows what he had in that. Heyman in the '90s revives. That's my theory. Now let's see if we can look at that.
And I can see that. I can see that. My only counter to that, and it will continue to be, is if none of these other territories succeed, he doesn't become Paulie Dangerously. He doesn't get the connects to start ECW. He has the moxie, he has the knowledge, he has all of the wherewithal to do that. But if he doesn't have the talent to come in, then I know you said it's built on new guys, and I get that. It's a whole different genre of wrestling, a whole different new thing. We get that. But if he doesn't have his notoriety from WCW, his contacts from WCW, and being in the business for so long, and being, like I said, and being Paulie Dangerously, how far does he really get? That's my counter.
Listen. I'm going to go and say I've never really cared for us to have. I mean, I appreciate the guests that we've had on our show on the previous iteration of what we were. Mm-hmm. But on this particular show, we got to get Heyman on this show and have this discussion with him present. Because I want to hear what he has to say about this scenario.
We talk about that, but I have to go back to Vern. I'm sorry.
I know you got to go back to Vern.
That's your guy.
Corey?
I'm gonna tell you why I got to go back to Vern. The reason I got to go back to Vern because Super Clash came after WrestleMania, and we're talking about alternative pathways, alternative brands. If WrestleMania 1 failed, I think Vern still would have had Super Clash because he wanted to stick one to Vince. He's always tried to the point even when Hogan left and the Sheik left, people were gonna pay the Sheik money to break Hogan's legs, right? So I think Vern would have still got the other organizations together. I can't remember the other federation. Wizard, help me out here. Who else joined with Vern to run Super Clash? It was a couple promotions together, right? Then the NWA jump in, like WCCW. It was like all the ones that I named earlier kind of got together to do Super Clash, right?
Right.
If I remember the story, right, Wizard, correct me. If I remember the story, the reason they got the attendance was like over 20,000 people in Chicago, right? So they technically beat the WWE number of 19,000 at Madison Square Garden. Right. The problem, from what I heard, was that David Crockett was accused of trying to steal talent from Vern Gagne backstage, and Vern got mad and they didn't want to do it anymore. So he didn't want to do it.
I've heard that story. I don't know how true that is, but I've heard.
Yeah, I don't know how true that is, but that's the story I heard. So that's why the rift came between the Super Clashes didn't become successful over a period of time because Crockett allegedly, I'm gonna say allegedly, I only assume, allegedly was stealing people from Vern Gagne, and it worked. So with that alternative,
because we only had what 3 Super Clashes, I think, 2 or 3.
Yeah, 2 or 3. So me going back to my theory is the alternative pathway is that Vern would try to stick Vince by still having Super Clash, and if David Crockett hadn't tried to steal people from Vince, Super Clash might have been more successful in the other iterations of it.
Wait, okay, Super Clash was 85, September 85. What
September
81 was what?
March of 85, so a few months later. So March, September.
But like we said, in the initial what if scenario for the failure of Mania, like the only way I could see them eclipse the stench of Mr. T killing it, right? Because we're all in agreement, like in order for this to fail, it was basically on Mr. T's shoulder, right?
It was on T's shoulder and not having the popularity from the MTV because the MTV show prior in February really kind of gave them momentum with the ticket sales increased.
Now, look, I'm looking at this Super Clash card, and I got to say, you got Steve Regal and Brad Riggins opening. Sherry Martel defeated Candy Devine. Mil Mascaras defeated Buddy Roberts. Greg Gagne, Scott Hall, and Kurt Hennig defeated Ray Stevens, Bockwinkel, and Zbyszko. Little Tokyo defeated Little T. Giant Baba, Jumbo Soruta, Tenru, and Harley Race. You got Kerry Von Erich on the card who pinned Jimmy Garvin. You got Crusher Khrushchev, Ivan Koloff, and Nikita Koloff. They defeated Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher and Baron. Jerry Blackwell beat Kamala. The Road Warriors defeated the Freebirds. Now, this is where we're starting to get interesting. Sergeant Slaughter versus Boris Zukov. Now, I have to say, if you look at top 3 in popularity in this wrestling sports entertainment sphere, you got Hulk Hogan, you got Mr. T, who is a star amongst all of them, but Sergeant Slaughter is pretty damn close.
Yes.
Because Sergeant Slaughter was on G.I. Joe. He had the action figures. He was in the animated series. He just wasn't on the TV show, and he didn't have cereal. So he was a star. You got Magnum TA, and then the main event was Rick Martel versus Stan Hansen. You go, Rick. I think I might have placed that card a little bit differently in hindsight.
But you got to realize, here's the theory, you got to realize why Rick Martel was the final main event. Right. Vern Gagne was a top promoter. Rick Martel, at the time, AWA champion. Right. So the AWA champion had to go on last doing that match. So there's the drop where Vern's still playing games in the midst of Super Clash.
And that's why I don't think it would have worked, because the internal infighting between promoters would have brought it right back down. Wiz, any input?
Who could have took the lead? Okay, Vince fails. Who takes my big with it?
No. I like the question. Go ahead. I'm answering. Go ahead.
If Vince, WWE fails, WrestleMania fails, Vince has to take a step back, I still think the company would exist. Which company rises to the top? Or which company prevails or capitalizes off the fact that WrestleMania has failed?
I think
In 1985,
in
1985, we can't go to ECW because it's not existing. I'm talking about those companies that existed in 85. Who comes up, if anyone does?
I think the NWA, and I it may sound a little, biased to what was popular at that point. I think Vern was just in too much of an old school mindset to even want to evolve at that point. I do think at least the NWA probably would have been open to it, even though they were just as traditional as AWA. But I think there's a glimmer of hope with a Ric Flair, with the possibility, with Dusty Rhodes, with there's glimmers of Magnum TA. There's glimmers of hope of stars that could be used at that point. But this is it's what if. That's the show. This is all in a situation where we're thinking the best case scenario that somebody can pick up the ball and run with it. I personally don't think anybody would have. If you call a spade, I don't think anybody would have succeeded. But for the sake of picking one, I would say the NWA.
And I would say NWA, and then Heyman comes along and Revolution.
I'll go NWA. I think Vern time had ended. I think NWA was the company that was going to come up and try, and especially with the Crockett's, and then maybe Ted Turner still would have got involved later on. You never know. I think that would have been the NWA would have took there. But I do think my heart of heart would tell me that WrestleMania had failed. Vince somehow was going to bounce back because with what I see today, he always bounces back with something, right? In my heart of heart, tell me that WrestleMania would have failed. We'd still be at WrestleMania something. It may not have been 39. He might have took 2 years off. Whatever case may be, regrouped and came back and called it something else. But I still think
Vince would have been a preacher.
Here's my thing though. You say that Vince, we always see Vince bounce back. Yes, we do. But are the resources available in 1985 for him to bounce back?
Allegedly, this is what allegedly, he had the NBC deal already taken care of. There's reports out there that he had a money from Antonio Inoki from Japan had given him $1 million for the services of Hulk Hogan and different wrestlers. That he had a deal out there for $1 million. So Vince, and he had some other deals that was going on as well. That Vince didn't really invest all his money, as the story goes. That he may have had some reserve back then just in case WWE had not. WrestleMania had not been a success. That he had about another $2 or $3 million, where it would have been time for him to still rebuild and regroup some things. So I think that's where I'm talking about the bounce back, knowing that he had allegedly had the money from Inoki. We know he had the NBC deal for Saturday Night Main Event. We don't know how that would have panned out if WrestleMania 1 has failed. So he still had some of that type of money. I think he had the money in the bank.
Well then.
In my opinion. Here's the question. Here's the big question as we close this up a little bit, talking about what if WrestleMania 1 had failed. Which wrestlers, right, today would it have affected that we would not have seen? Or it would have altered their trajectory? And the ones that come to my mind is the second and third generation wrestlers who've been around the building, who've been around the business, and was in the building during those times. Like you look like the Rocks, the Randy Ortons, and those type of guys who had some stake in WWE, or their families had stake in WWE at the time.
Well, that's really interesting. If you look at it from a lineage standpoint, it may have changed the trajectory of third generation guys. I think I'll go from top down. I think Hulk Hogan will be a star regardless, right? I think he goes on to Hollywood. I think he'll come back to NWA. He'll make some spot appearances on some wrestling shows. And I think that around the time where in my Paul Heyman timeline, I think he's pretty much done by then, and I don't think he becomes the Hulk Hogan that we've known him to be, but I do think he makes it at a certain level of success in Hollywood. I think Andre the Giant lingers around a bit. I think the guys that were on the card that would ultimately leave WWE, I think they stick around, and they do their rounds in the promotions like they've always done. I think Mr. T continues to be Mr. T.
Yeah,
he ain't going to the Hall of Fame. And I think this is really good right here. I'm trying to think. I think Piper goes to Hollywood as well. I think he goes and he has his success, but I think everyone below the top of the card, I believe they just go back to the territory days and they make their money the old-fashioned way.
All right. Well, repeat that question one more time. I just want to make sure I cover every point of it.
All right. The question was, wrestlers today or those that were on the card, how their trajectory been affected? And I talked about the second and third generation wrestlers trajectory, because a lot of those guys said they watched WrestleMania 1 or they was in the building for WrestleMania 1, right? And so their family really depended on WrestleMania 1 kind of being successful. I talked about a Cowboy Bob Orton, right? Maybe a Rocky Johnson around that time. Those that were really invested in the business. How would it change the trajectory of some of those stars as well as those on the card?
So, I think to touch on, I don't think we don't get Rock, we don't get Roman Reigns, we don't get Randy Orton, we don't get Cody Rhodes, name anybody second generation or up. I don't even think we get them if it fails. Hogan probably goes to Hollywood. He was already in Hollywood before WWF anyway. So Hogan, everything that Champ said, I'm pretty much along the same line. But like you mentioned with these, second generation guys, I was in the building or I watched WrestleMania. We don't even see them in the ring.
That's big, because that changes the mark of wrestling that we know, right? The era that we kind of people really sink their teeth into, because of the failure of WrestleMania. Even if Vince could have reincarnated it somehow and made another entity of WrestleMania, calling it something else. I'm glad that it didn't fail, because we up to 39, headed until we're to 40. Has been a staple in most of our lives, and some of our lives, for all our life, that WrestleMania has been a staple there. So I think it's a great possibility, a great chance that I'm glad that it did not fail, and that Vince had the opportunity to be successful, and it helped everyone along the way. It helped the wrestling business. I want to say this: WrestleMania 1 helped the wrestling business and allowed people to know they can put on super shows and it still be successful, right? Look at even to now. If you don't have WrestleMania 1, you don't have the AEW Super Show, right? Look at all the pay-per-views that we had back in the 90s. Everything started to follow the Vince McMahon product of how WrestleMania was built. And so if WrestleMania 1 fails, we might not even get to pay wrestling pay-per-views again, champ. We may not have. So again, where we at now, it has grown. Vince McMahon did a wonderful job. Again, let's wrap this up real quick. Recap your hypothetical scenario if WrestleMania had failed and some of the potential outcomes.
Say that again.
Recap your hypothetical scenario if WrestleMania had failed and the outcomes that you think is going to happen. Just give it a recap.
Yes. So WrestleMania 1 fails. I think at that point, everybody pulls out of whatever. Pro wrestling, from a presentation standpoint, was at its high with WrestleMania as far as what you saw on the television screen. Nobody else's output looked like that. I don't even think it's replicated. People may get the idea and see what Vince may have done from a production standpoint and try to replicate it, but they never get to the full amount of resources to do so. I think wrestling still kind of lingers on in its carny/territorial situation. You can only hope somebody else comes across with the resources to get the TV deal, but it's kind of hard if the resources of what Vince McMahon had from a Hulk Hogan and all this, Mr. T and all of that, if that doesn't succeed, what reputable television or movie or anybody hitches their wagon to professional wrestling?
Champ, man, same question.
I'm in agreement. Oh man, I got to echo. Or is it because you got a mute G? All right, we good? All right. So I think that Mr. T kills wrestling. He ain't getting in the Hall of Fame. The industry goes back to the last vestiges of the territorial days. You have your wrestling stars and you have your diehards that follow it, but it never reaches that pop culture climax that it reached with WrestleMania until we get to the 90s, where another visionary by the name of Paul Heyman comes in and he creates Extreme Mania, and the stars that we look at from the 80s that we remember, they never come to be, but the new stars of the 90s emerge, where you have the emergence of Steve Austin there. You have New Jack becomes a star. He's basically your new modern day hardcore Mr. T. You have Sandman. You have Tommy Dreamer. You have Jericho come in. You have Rey Mysterio come in. Everyone that came through the doors of ECW that we remember, they become the stars of the new realm of professional wrestling, the extreme universe of professional wrestling. And I think that sets us off on a chart to where Heyman, who has the relationship with the networks, TNN, you have UFC coming up, he has his hands involved in MMA, and this merger that we just happen to have, which is now known as Combat Sports Entertainment, dare I say, that happens before 2023 where we are now. I think Heyman helps that happen around 2010.
Hey, and that concludes our discussion on what a WrestleMania 1 had failed. Oh man, we had a great discussion tonight. Thank you for joining us, man. This journey through the hypothetical situations of WrestleMania 1. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media for updates on upcoming episodes and behind the scene content. Thanks for listening, and remember, in the world of wrestling, anything is possible with a little imagination. See you next time.